April 1980. In northern Idaho, just outside the small town of Cedar Hollow, along the banks of the Salmon River, Walter Hendricks stood on a scorched hillside. He was 63. His shoulders had rounded from 40 years of logging work, his palms were as rough as tree bark, and there was a weariness in his eyes that ran deeper than age. 3 months earlier, his wife Eleanor had died. Lung cancer, the likely legacy, though no doctor ever confirmed it, of 40 years spent breathing sawdust and mill smoke. Walter himself had spent his whole life cutting trees. He had cleared ridge after ridge, sent truckload after truckload of fir and pine down to the mills, and now, having lost Eleanor, he looked at the hills around him for what felt like the first time, bare, scarred, never having recovered from a brutal wildfire back in 1974. That afternoon, driving home from her grave, he pulled his truck over in front of that burned hillside, nearly 200 acres, once dense fir forest, burned to nothing, and the rain had long since washed away the topsoil that might have let anything grow back on its own. Now there was only gray rock, dry scrub, and the occasional patch of sagebrush. Walter got out and stood there a long while. Then, for no reason he could quite name, or maybe because of something Eleanor used to say, "You've spent your whole life cutting trees down, Walt." He pulled a shovel out of the bed of his truck. The ground was rocky and hard, his hands blistered on the very first hole. He kept digging anyway. There were a few ponderosa pine saplings in the truck. He'd actually bought them to plant in his own yard, but now he knelt with them on that burned earth instead. 1, 2, 3 saplings. Before evening fell, he had planted 7. He came back the next day, and the day after that. At first, people in town thought grief had scrambled the old man's mind. Some laughed about it. Walt Hendricks spent his whole life as a logger, and now he says he's going to plant a forest. At the local bar, the Red Elk Saloon, his old friends ribbed him over it, but Walter never said much back. Every morning at dawn, he loaded his old pickup with saplings, a shovel, and a jug of water and drove up into the hills. In that first year he planted nearly 400 saplings, maybe 60 survived. The rest withered and died. The soil had no nutrients, the rain was unreliable, and deer would strip any tender new growth the moment it appeared. Walter wasn't discouraged. He started noticing where water pooled, where the ground was a little softer, which slopes got less sun. He borrowed books from the local library, on soil science, on reforestation techniques, despite never having any formal schooling in either. The librarian, Margaret Chen, an avid naturalist herself, began helping him. It was she who told him about the local soil conservation service, who could test his soil free of charge. By 1982, Walter had learned how to build small stone check dams to hold back rainwater and keep the soil from washing away. He noticed that it wasn't just pine that suited this land, some Douglas fir and western larch took to it too. He built a small nursery behind his house using an old greenhouse frame, where he started growing saplings from seed instead of buying them. During those years, his daughter Diana, who lived in Boise, called every weekend to ask, "Dad, are you all right? Is it really wise, at your age, climbing up that hill alone to do all this?" Walter would laugh and say, "I've got the time, sweetheart, and trees aren't in any hurry." In truth, something like penance was working in Walter too, though he'd never have used that word. For 40 years he'd made his living cutting down the trees on these very hills. The same hands that once felled hundreds of trees with a saw were now digging holes in the earth to plant new ones. It felt, in some way, like paying off a debt. In the winter of 1984, a brutal snowstorm killed off many of his newly planted saplings. Walter started over again that spring with fresh resolve. This time he got help from a young Forest Service ranger, Tom Bradley. Tom had assumed at first that this was just some old man's eccentric hobby, but Walter's persistence impressed him. He taught Walter about natural forest regeneration, which species grew best at which elevations, and how to plan a reforestation project that could resist future wildfires. By 1987, nearly 50 acres of the burned hillside were dotted with young saplings. They were still only knee-high, but from a distance you could make out a faint green tint where before there had been only gray and brown. Attitudes in town slowly began to shift. The jokes at the Red Elk Saloon grew rare. Some people even grew curious. A local high school science teacher, Carol Weaver, took her students up one day to see Walter's forest. Walter walked them through it, showing which trees had been planted when, how the soil composition was changing, how small insects and birds were beginning to return. One student asked, "Will you ever get to see this forest fully grown?" Walter smiled a little. "No, son, it takes fir trees more than 100 years to reach full maturity. I probably won't even live to see it hit its teenage years. But somebody's got to plant it. If nobody plants today, nobody gets the shade 100 years from now." That line stuck with Carol Weaver. She wrote a short piece about it for the local paper, the Cedar Hollow Gazette. It didn't cause much of a stir at first, but interest slowly grew. In 1988, news of the devastating Yellowstone fires spread across the country. People in Idaho grew anxious about their own forests. Suddenly, Walter's project took on new meaning. People began to understand that burned land doesn't just turn green again on its own. It takes years of human care. That year, for the first time, a handful of volunteers joined Walter on the hillside. A retired school teacher named Frank Osorio, and a young couple newly settled in town. For the first time, Walter wasn't alone up there. 1990 brought Walter a hard blow. One spring night he suffered a heart episode. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The doctors were blunt. At his age, all this exertion, especially the digging and climbing, was dangerous. His daughter Diana finally put her foot down. "Dad, you have to stop, or I swear I'll come get you and bring you to Boise myself." Lying in his hospital bed, Walter thought long and hard. He knew his body wasn't what it used to be, but he also knew he couldn't stop. In the end, he struck a compromise with his daughter. He would no longer do the heavy work alone, but he'd keep the project going with others' help. After that, Walter's role changed. He no longer swung the shovel himself every time. Instead, he became a teacher, a planner. With the Forest Service's support, he founded a small volunteer organization, the Cedar Hollow Reforestation Project. Now, every Saturday morning, 10 or 12 people gathered on the hillside. Walter taught them where and how to plant saplings, how to mulch young trees to help the soil hold moisture. In 1992, the local bank manager, Harold Stevens, who had once been skeptical of Walter's whole endeavor, arranged a small grant from the bank to buy saplings. The owner of the hardware store began donating shovels and gloves every year. Even the Red Elk Saloon started providing free food each year for a tree planting day. In the summer of 1993, a severe drought struck Idaho. Many of the young trees in Walter's forest were in danger. Every day, he and his volunteers hauled water up the hill in tanks to pour at the base of each sapling. The sight, a man pushing 80, sunburned, dragging a water tank up a hillside, caught the attention of a local news station. A reporter came from Boise and filed a segment on it. After that broadcast, letters started arriving for Walter from all over the state. Some sent donations. Others wanted to know how to start similar projects in their own communities. An environmental organization even nominated him for a small award, though Walter initially refused to even attend the ceremony. "I'm no hero," he'd say. "I'm just an old man trying to fix a mistake." That drought year, about 15% of the saplings died. But remarkably, the trees planted earliest, whose roots had by then grown deep, mostly survived. Walter drew an important lesson from this, one he often repeated to new volunteers. The first few years are the hardest. But once the roots go deep enough, the tree learns to fight its own battles. In 1995, Walter took his first grandchild, Jesse, up the hill with him. The boy was 7. Walter handed him a small pine sapling and said, "This one's yours, Jesse. When you grow up, this tree will too." Every summer after that, Jesse came up with his grandfather to tend to his tree. It became something of a family tradition. By 1997, the earliest trees planted were 17 years old. Some of the ponderosa pines now stood 15 to 20 feet tall. From a distance, a large stretch of the hillside now looked genuinely green, though the forest was still young and thin. That year brought an important change. Wildlife began returning. Herds of elk and mule deer started sheltering in the shade of the new trees. Bird watchers noted that several species which had abandoned the area after the fire were coming back. One volunteer even spotted bobcat tracks. Walter was nearly 80 now. His body was weakening, and he needed a cane to get around, but every Saturday morning he still went up the hill, though now he spent most of his time sitting in the truck, directing the younger volunteers on where to plant. In 1998, the Forest Service formally recognized Walter's project as a model, and similar initiatives began in neighboring counties. Tom Bradley, now a senior Forest Service official, told Walter that his approach, using native species, working with natural regeneration rather than against it, and involving the whole community, had become a guiding example for reforestation projects across the state. That autumn, the Cedar Hollow Town Council decided to officially name the burned hillside Hendricks Forest. Walter objected at first. "This wasn't just my work," he said at the council meeting. "It was Eleanor's work. Who taught me how to think. It was Tom's and Margaret's work, who taught me how to do it right. It was every kid's work who ever came up here and planted a tree." In the end, they reached a compromise. The site would be named Eleanor and Walter Hendricks Memorial Forest. In the spring of 2000, Walter was 83. His body no longer cooperated the way it used to, but his mind was as sharp as ever. On a morning in April, exactly 20 years since he'd planted his first sapling, the town held a ceremony to mark the occasion. Over 100 people gathered at the foot of the hill. By then, Hendricks Forest stretched across nearly 300 acres, with about 60,000 trees planted over the years. The earliest trees now stood more than 40 feet tall, and in their shade, a new generation of trees was starting to sprout on its own. Nature was carrying the work forward by itself. At the ceremony, Walter gave a short speech from his wheelchair, since walking had become too difficult for him by then. He said, "20 years ago, I came up this hill with a broken heart. I thought I was planting trees to heal this land, but really, this land healed me. I won't live 100 years to see this forest reach full maturity, but every child standing here today might, and their children will sit in the shade these trees give, a shade we're building right now, in this moment, with this shovel." Never start something only because you expect to see it finished. Real good work, work that actually matters, is almost always bigger than any one of our lifetimes. And that's exactly as it should be. If we only ever did the things we'd live to see completed, what would we leave our grandchildren? At the end of the ceremony, Walter's grandson Jesse, now 12, stood beside that very first sapling and planted a new one for his own grandchildren someday, even though he had no children of his own yet. "This one's for my grandkids," he said, echoing the words his grandfather had taught him. Walter Hendricks passed away in January 2003, peacefully, in his sleep, at 86. His funeral was held right there in Hendricks Forest, on a clear winter day, among rows of snow-covered trees. Nearly the whole town came, those who had once laughed at him, and those who had stood beside him doing the work. All of them. He was buried next to Eleanor in the town's old cemetery, but his real monument was that hillside, which no longer went by the name, the Burned Hill. The project didn't stop with his death. The Cedar Hollow Reforestation Project continues to this day, now a formal nonprofit, whose annual Walter's Day event draws hundreds of people to plant new trees. Jesse Hendricks grew up to become a forester and took over leadership of the project as a young man. Today, the Hendricks Memorial Forest spans nearly 450 acres. The first trees, the 7 saplings Walter planted with his own hands that April afternoon, now stand over 60 feet tall, part of a dense canopy of mature fir and pine. Birds, deer, elk, and occasionally even bears are now regular sights there. At the entrance to the forest stands a small wooden marker that reads, "This forest is not a monument to one man, but to a decision, the decision to try to repair with your own hands what you have seen broken, even if you never live to see it finished." Walter Hendricks, 1917 to 2003.